I'm excited to welcome Dr. Rick Cruse of Iowa State University to the show. Dr. Cruse is a professor of agronomy and serves as the director of the Iowa Water Center. His research looks at soil erosion, soil management, and the physical properties of soil, as well as issues around water quality. You know, with how close soil science is to geology, there will be terrible
Oh,
puns on my end. So let's dig in. All
please.
joking aside, thanks for being here, Rick.
I didn't hear that, Jess. I just didn't. I heard it, but yes, I'll find a way to top that before we're done. And you know more about me than I do, so that's kind of scary to begin with. But yeah, we'll
Well,
go with it.
we do our research here at Union of Concerned Scientists, but so in geology, we do have a joke about the difference between soil and dirt. For us, it's soil when we get paid, and it's dirt when we're not getting paid. Uh, so there's a lot more nuance to the world of soil. So can you
Well,
tell me what initially drew you to your research?
oh wow. And I'll go on, and you shut me off whenever if I'm getting off track too far. I started in fisheries and wildlife biology. Love the outdoors, and that was as an undergraduate. And a guy I roomed with in college said, "Get out of the field." He was getting a master's degree. He says, "There's no jobs." So I did, and I shopped around, and I thought, in an agricultural area, I grew up in Iowa, soils and the opportunity to manage those may give us an opportunity to affect that population of wildlife critters that I was so enthralled with at that time. So I did. Well, that doesn't answer your question yet about how I got engaged with the area that I'm working in. Um, the area is associated with sustainability, and that includes sustainability of the waters that these fish and whatever else swim in that I love a lot. Deer, pheasants, all the habitat things. Um, we're, we're being damaged by poor use of the soil resource base. And one of the greatest negative impacts associated with that is soil erosion. And I started trying to connect some dots. I could see that the practices that were targeted for controlling soil erosion, improving soil health, improving soil quality, were those that oftentimes favored that wildlife population that I was so enthralled with. So that, and then money also helps attract activity, and when there were resources to work in this, that was kind of cool. And I was driving down the road one time. Again, I'm on the tracks, but maybe going further than you want. Just stop me; I won't be offended. We're driving down the road with John Laughlin, who is a kind of a godfather in the soil erosion area. He's passed now. But I asked John, I just watched a weather report. This was about 2000. That showed rainfall estimates using radar and understanding some things about soil erosion, what causes it, heavy rain, slopes, soil types, crops, whatever. I said, John, I said, why couldn't we use that type of information and actually estimate soil erosion across the whole state of Iowa? He sat there in his car and looked kind of funny. He slid forward on his seat. He says, "We can." So at that point in time, we started building a team that's now called the Daily Erosion Project, and had that group together for 20 years now, and still riding that horse.
That's amazing. I mean, I love people's origin stories because, superheroes aren't real, but to me, scientists are doing the work of superheroes. I mean, we're using our brains to try to confront the villains, as it were, of sometimes of our own invention, but also just it's difficult. It's difficult to scale up like our population has without understanding all of the different factors that go in. And I love that you have that holistic perspective of its biology, living creature biology and plant biology connected to the soil. I mean, without that available, without the nutrients available, what are we going to do? Oh, starve.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Part of what you're saying, I just taught a class in sustainable ag just before we connected here, and my lead on message was that we as scientists are very good at describing our own little discipline. But if we're going to make progress in terms of communicating to the general population, we have to do exactly what you're saying. We have to connect those dots, one science curriculum to another, to another, to another, to see how those components interact. It's about interactions. That's what drives stuff forward. If we only understand our simple little silo, we're not going to win.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so, the introduction to this episode, which you haven't heard yet, is about the Dust Bowl because I found that completely fascinating when I read a book called "The Worst Hard Time" about it, and so we know that the removal of native vegetation and resulting loss of topsoil via erosion helped to create the conditions that the U.S. experienced during the Dust Bowl. And then scientists, the government, and local farmers work together to solve the problem and help stop the Dust Bowl from continuing. So, can you kind of give us a state of the soil today?
Mm. You said we have 3 days to do this, right? I'm
Oh,
joking.
totally. Yep. Just go on.
Yeah. Uh, in general, soils are degrading, which means that the condition is still going downhill. Now, understand there are areas, there are farms, there are locations where the opposite is true. I talk to people a lot about a bell-shaped curve, which is simply a frequency distribution. I think most people understand. On one end of that curve, we have farmers. I'm talking about farmers and their attitudes towards conservation. We have individuals that will literally die to do the right thing. They're going to use whatever practices are necessary to improve their soil health, sustainability, longevity of that farm. On the other end of that spectrum, you have individuals that seemingly could care less. You won't find a stitch of green in their field other than in our part of the world, corn or soybeans. And stuff is going south on us in those areas. And then we got a variety of people in the middle that understand the importance of soil health, soil quality. And, some of those are okay. So some parts of your field may be getting better. Other parts of the field, the sloping areas, may be getting poorer. There's a cultural dynamic associated with this too, Jess. And if I'm wading off again in the waters you don't want to get to, stop me.
No, no,
And,
please continue. I love this.
okay, and that involves land ownership. You know, let's step away from land. I have a hunting buddy that tells me, he says, Rick, I don't understand anything about agriculture, but I understand there's nothing that starts faster, stops quicker, or corners harder than a rented car. When it comes to land, I mean, we say the same thing about apartment ownership or apartment renting or house ownership. When it comes to farmland, I've had multiple farmers tell me on my own land, conservation practices are an investment. On my rented land, they're a cost. It doesn't mean that every farmer that rents land is doing things that's not favorable. But most of them will tell you the incentive to do the type of thing that we're talking about to improve the soil condition for the next year or the next year or the next year is lost if you don't know you're going to farm that land for multiple years.
I mean, you just
So
blew my mind. You blow my mind anyway, talking about rented land. That isn't something that I think most of us city dwellers really have to even reckon with. So is that very common?
in Iowa, the majority is rented. The majority of land, cropland, is farmed by people that do not own the land. Some
Wow.
are around 55 to 60%, actually.
Whoa.
So,
Okay. Okay.
and another component of this too often, is a bidding war. Whoever's willing to pay the most has the opportunity to farm the land. Now, if you and I are in a bidding war, and there are some places they have rental auctions, the highest bidder actually in an exchange gets to rent the land. As I bid higher and higher, what's the first thing I'm going to take out of my operation? Things that don't return the dollar to me, and typically that's conservation practices, at least not on the short term.
That's super interesting. I mean, it doesn't it never crossed my mind that that was happening. Even though my grandfather and grandmother owned a farm in Kansas for years that did corn and soybeans, and they
Mhm.
ended up selling it to the family that used to do the farming for them.
Mhm.
So I only knew it in the context of ownership. That's absolutely fascinating. So
Yeah.
just thinking, because you mentioned obviously that soil is degrading, and then the conservation measures are, they don't generate profit. So obviously that will be the first thing that people eliminate if it's not their asset on the line. So, but of course, I want to connect this big picture again. So, how is climate change contributing to the current conditions that farmers are reckoning with?
Wow. Well, the first thing is that too many farmers still want to deny that climate change is real, even though they understand. And that's not all of them. That's not all of them at all. Every farmer is different. The Iowa Farm Bureau will tell you every farmer is different, but for different reasons. And but it's true. Okay, we've got some farmers out there that are champions of the climate change thing and are forward thinking, really, really great people. Um, so how is it impacting? The biggest impact at this point in time are the inundation rains that we see popping up and occurring in different places. Farmers have not in the past experienced an 8 or 10 inch rain. Several decades ago, several, three, four, when I was a kid, or at least closer to a kid, a 4 inch rain was a big deal. Now you can almost double that with some of the rains that we're seeing. So that, in many minds, is opening some doors relative to what's happening, and the impact of those rainstorms is huge in the areas where they're falling, especially if it's earlier in the season before you have complete canopy cover. Another facet of climate change that is affecting everybody, and whether they accept it or not as part of climate change, is that growing seasons are getting longer. We're planting corn and soybeans earlier and have the opportunity to harvest later, although the maturity time is still somewhat like it was before. So the number of frost-free days is increasing. The dew point temperature, which means humidity, is increasing. I was giving a workshop, a discussion with a group of farmers addressing biofuels. And one of the comments I started, I mentioned what I just said here, that dew point temperatures are increasing. One of the farmers, he says, "Hell, we know that." He says, "Why do you think we have such big combine heads?" He said, "We know that to get soybeans harvested, we have a shorter and shorter time frame. The dew comes sooner in the evening and it stays longer in the morning." They know it. They experience, they see it. But your question was impact on soils. The heavy rains have a big impact on soil loss. Big impact. Those disproportionately affect soil loss.
That makes sense.
Rising rising temperatures increase the rate of chemical reaction in the soil. And the chemical reaction we're talking about here is oxidation. Well, that's academic speak for organic matter decomposes more rapidly. The warmer the fire, the faster things burn. Well, the warmer the soil, the more rapid the organic matter is lost. If you go to southern U.S., Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, what color are the soils? Typically
Oh,
red. They're the
yep.
color of the parent material. As you move further north, we've got the winters, we got whatever. The black is because of soil particles being coated with organic matter.
That makes sense because yeah, red is usually a sign of the iron being present
Yes,
and it's oxidizing. So for
yes,
my world, oxidization basically makes rocks turn red.
yes. Mine
Oh,
too. Mine
cool.
too. So, there's a couple things that are having an impact. As climate changes the crops that are being grown, that also will change the amount of organic material that can be deposited and be retained in soils. Now, we haven't seen that huge of an impact yet because the bigger impact is still anthropogenic choices that farmers make. Do you cover crop? Do you not cover crop? Do you grow row crop exclusively, or do you rotate, put some other crops in? So if climate change can change the heat, this part, that will have the bigger impact on soils
Huh.
than will the simple change. And there's one other thing I'd like to mention about this. It's a statement that Pete Nowak made, and it was about biology more than soils, but I think it applies to soils too. He told me, he says, Rick, he says, always remember, biology is not limited by averages. It's limited by extremes. And the soil, same thing happens relative to soil degradation. That average conditions don't have an impact. When I ask that, I say when we see what is the average rainfall in a given area for a year, if that average is creeping up or down, that's not a big deal. But if embedded within that average change, you see these infrequent, highly erosive, high intense rainstorms, and that's what we're seeing more frequently. That has a much bigger impact than just looking at that average that's creeping up.
Excellent observation. I love that too, that it's limited by extremes, not averages. I think that should be on bumper stickers, but I don't know if it would be overly popular among the non-science crowd, but I think it's brilliant. So
Um,
yeah. So I did want to know, because you mentioned that there are a lot of folks in the farming world who don't believe in climate change. So are you seeing the kind of collaboration between science, government, and agrarian communities that's happened in the past, or are they leaning more towards other methods of solving their problems that are a little bit more siloed?
I think the community approach is gaining some traction. Um, Misery loves company, and creativity in the farm world, also likes to build along with what do you know, what have you tried, what's worked for you, what's not working for me. The term climate resilience is getting some traction. That's different than climate change. Using systems or approaches that will allow cropping systems to be resilient when experiencing weather stress or climate stress. So yeah, we see some more cooperation occurring in that area. People, especially, trying to target use of water. We're talking soils, but to be quite honest, a plant doesn't need soil. We can grow plants hydroponically. What soil does, it's the reservoir for the nutrients that the plant has to have, and it is the reservoir for water that plants must take up. So anyway, the interest in soil health, interest in improving soil conditions, even though I said previously, we're degrading, we're seeing more and more interest, inquisitive farmers about what can we do. This water thing, they understand better than any of us that if they can add an additional inch of water for their crops to use, they will benefit. Right? I talk to farmers and I ask them, we talk about the water thing. They said, hell, there's nothing we can do. I said, that's not true. You take especially look at your sloping areas, water that runs off is not available. If you cover crop those areas or use some practices that improve your soil conditions so that the rain that falls can infiltrate, that's money in your pocket.
So just
They
for a
understand.
quick side note, because I'm sure that there are many folks who are our listeners who know what the term cover crop means, but can you explain what a cover crop is versus a non-cover crop?
Yeah, a great point, Jess. And if I use some type of vocabulary that I need to explain, please let me know. I'm not going to be offended. Yeah, I actually feel smarter when I use a word that somebody doesn't understand. I'm just kidding.
Same.
Yeah, yeah. I cover crops in the row crop world, which is what we are in the Midwest. We're dominantly row crop, basically corn and beans. From the time that you harvest until the next crop is planted and it germinates, there's nothing in that soil, nothing, no crop, living crop at all. Cover crops are crops that are planted, low value crops in terms of, and you don't get any commodities out of them, but they're a planted crop that grows after the crop is harvested, after the main crop is harvested. It grows until it gets so dang cold it can't grow anymore. And if it is a type of species that will overwinter, it will start growing again in spring. So people often look at the top of the plant and think, oh, that's great. In reality, the soil benefits almost exclusively from the roots of those cover crops. So anyway, the question was cover crop. So it is a crop that fills that open time space between harvest and planting of the next crop.
So basically, instead of letting your field be completely fallow and empty, you put this cover crop in place, which the roots will help stop the erosion.
Yes,
Uh,
and also you've got cover. Anytime you have cover, by chance you get that rainstorm, freak rainstorm in the fall or really early spring, any surface cover that will intercept raindrop energy is a good thing.
That's okay, great. I think that makes it super clear, especially for folks who like have never thought about farming at all, which
Sure,
is,
sure.
in our modern world, that's fairly common. So because most of our listeners hail from major urban areas and the coasts, which means that they don't have to think about farming and unless there's a supply shortage or an outbreak of E. coli or something. So from your perspective, what are the most critical facts about the current state of our soils and our ability to sustain this crop growth and to feed ourselves and our animals? What are the most important things you think folks who don't interact with farming should know?
Well, the most important part, I think, Jess, and I'm not sidestepping your question, but I'm going to take it a little bit different direction. I mentioned water. Water, water is the elephant in the room. It absolutely is. 70% of all freshwater use is for growing crops. It's irrigation. New York Times today had an article in it that just spells out just on on the target the serious condition that we're in relative to water availability and water loss from aquifers we're using to irrigate crops. So you got a water issue and now the soil issue. As I kind of alluded to before, soils are the reservoir. They're the sponge. They're the sponge that holds water so that plants can take that water between rainstorms. If water runs off, and that's what we see, there was a study conducted and published 2 years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and which is a pretty prestigious journal. But anyway, the point was 35% of the land area in the Corn Belt, that's the Midwest US, is devoid of topsoil. So what is topsoil? Topsoil is that black organic matter rich surface layer that makes Iowa the king of corn production, or at least that's the story. 35% of the area, there's variability with that estimate, but that estimate is 35% of the area that topsoil has been lost. Now, I understand originally the topsoil depth in Iowa was averaged about 14 to 16 inches. It ain't
Wow.
there. So now the people that live in the urban area that have you ever tried to grow a garden in an area that you have is a construction site?
Yep.
There's no topsoil there.
Yeah.
Well, you're growing, trying to grow stuff in the type of material, not beat up quite so bad in an egg field, when that topsoil is missing.
So I want to, follow on that and ask you, what are you personally most excited about in the soil science and agrarian world right now?
Hmm. There are a couple things. The greatest positive thing is we're improving our understanding of the relationship between water and where water exists in agricultural areas and soil itself. As I mentioned, water drives. Water is the big animal in the room. Now, where are we coming from water? We've talked about irrigation a little bit, but I want to talk about areas of the world in the Midwest where the water table is sufficiently close to the soil surface that crop roots can actually extract or use some of that water to buffer any water shortages they may have during the year. And if you have corn and bean roots, they typically can extend far enough down, 4, 5, 6 feet that they can access this water in some locations. Now, I mentioned before this study where we find areas and fields that are consistently high yielding year after year after year. And in my mind, and this is a hypothesis at this point in time, we haven't done the work, we proposed it. I'm thinking it's access to that water. We can add nitrogen, we can add phosphorus, we can add the other things that are necessary in terms of nutrients for the plant. The thing that we can't control if we're not irrigating, and over most of the Midwest we're not, is that water. The areas where the plants are consistently under yielding suggest to me that there is a water limitation. There may be a fertility limitation of some type, but most farmers have the capacity to adjust fertility. In those areas where crop corn and beans don't have sufficiently deep rooting to have an access to that water source, could we grow something else, alfalfa, some other crop that has a potential to access that water? If we understand where we have water limitations in our fields, can we manage those soils differently to maximize infiltration? Kind of since I've mentioned before, water that runs off isn't available. Water that or crops growing in a position on the field that doesn't have access to subsurface water has to rely on everything that falls out of the sky. And having the capacity and knowing where we don't have this yet, but we're working on mapping this out, where these areas are should be very informing in terms of how we manage what we manage. And this is kind of exciting to me, maybe in a little bit sadistic way. And I don't mean it is. If we have some farmers that are trying to get into this business, they're willing to manage the bejeebers out of their land area. In other words, if they're willing to go through the work of managing these smaller areas in the field in a way that will maximize their productivity year after year, even though it might be different crops, can they compete with the farmer that has 100-foot booms and all the big equipment that's going to do the same thing from one edge of the field to the other and one end to the other? Might this open up some opportunities? It's exciting. Doesn't None of this is proven yet. We're looking at data that exists and think maybe that can be done. The other thing that's exciting, and now I'm getting into the my own little silo, is that our capacity to estimate soil erosion spatially at small time frames is increasing. I mentioned started out about rainfall estimates using radar.
Hmm.
Now, in the system we have, the Daily Erosion Project, we have a rainfall estimate every 2 minutes for every about 1/6 of a square mile.
Wow.
We use LIDAR to get all of our surface slopes and elevations. We have databases that tell us what crops are being grown, what soils exist. In other words, we have all the information necessary to run these computer models that will give us an estimate of how much soil is actually moving on the landscape. It helps us inform, goes back to the questions you were asking earlier. Are soils getting better or getting worse? And if they're getting worse, where are they getting worse? Where do we need to spend the money to improve practices? So it's it's fun. It's like the technology we're talking about. It's a challenge, but we like challenges.
Yes, and I think it's cool because so many people, I mean, in the US, a lot of us have ancestors who farmed, or it's just it was baked in to so much of America for a couple hundred years that you farm, you do it by hand, you have farm animals, you have increasing mechanization. But now to bring in technology like lidar, I mean, that's 21st century farming, and
Yes.
I mean, farming has entered the digital age, and it's just a matter of updating our understanding of what farming really is these days. So, along that kind of a line of what we need to think about to be truly forward thinking and resilient, what can the government do to help incentivize farmers to conserve? Particularly, I think, in the case of if you have got rented land, and should the government be doing something?
No, I might lose my job if I answer this the wrong way. No. Um, I think incentivize conservation practices. I mean, that's the best thing we can do. It's easy for me to say make rules, regulate, and in my mind, honestly, that's the only way. That's the only way we're going to solve some of these issues. And I've given talks. I talk to a lot of farmers, and I've been giving talks multiple times. I've had farmers in amongst other farmers say we need more rules. I said, "What do you mean? You want to be regulated?" No, but and they'll mention the name. Farms into the ditch, neighbor farms into the ditch. There's no grass waterways. I cannot compete with them on the short run. If we have to farm the same way to conserve soil, I'm better than they are, and I can do what needs to be done. But on the short run, I simply can't. They're really distraught about that. Yeah, I have another farm. A farmer is actually a nephew. He's got 20 different landlords, a big operator. And I asked him one time, I said, Mike, I said, if you had to grow cover crops, what would be your reaction? He says, I don't mind as long as everybody else has to. So it's a level playing field.
Ah,
It's really, really difficult, though, to create any type of a farm program that's equally fair, not program, but rules for the renter, for the owner, for the individual in Iowa versus Kansas. If we were to invoke a law, but you have to have cover crops in Iowa, it will not work because that puts the people here at the short term disadvantage to those in Illinois if they don't.
yeah.
So in my world, and I could get shot when I walk out of the building. There's going to have if the true goal priority is to sustain the soil resource, it has to be done through rules. You've got some farmers that absolutely do not need rules that do better, but you've got some that absolutely will not. And we get the argument back if we have a limit of how much soil we lose, then everybody's going to farm to that limit. That's not true. There is no evidence that I've seen anywhere that does it. In grad school, you have to maintain a GPA of 3.25. Does that mean everybody does a 3.25? Absolutely not. And I can go on down the list. So anyway, I get I just look at evidence and evidence and evidence to see what might work, and that one is really challenging when we try to do everything on a volunteer basis.
I mean, basically, it's evidence-based policymaking is what we
Yes.
need, which I am a huge proponent of. So excellently put, I think. And so we have one last question to go
Mhm.
through here. And because we are the Union of Concerned Scientists, so I ask everybody I have on the show this question. Rick, why are you concerned
About soils.
about anything? It's whatever
About
answer you
anything.
want to give. I mean, you could say I'm
Um,
concerned. You can be concerned about anything, but if you want to make it for your field, that's probably ideal.
sure. Well, I'll just say sustainability in general. When I look at what's happening globally, whether you're talking about wars, the big thing to me is water. Water is huge. We are kind of on the precipice of collapse. And I'll give you an example relative to food production. 40% of the world's food is produced on only 18% of the world's agricultural land. What do you
Ooh,
suppose is special about that 18%?
access?
It's irrigated.
Really?
It's
Okay.
yes. A bundle of that irrigation is coming from aquifers that are being depleted. So what does that do to the stress put on soils in the dryland part of the world, like we have in the Midwest?
Yeah.
It's going to put increased pressure on this soil resource to produce. What does that say relative to the need for conservation? If these soils are degraded and we lose production capacity in other parts of the world, um, What's happened to the production capacity in Ukraine? And you suppose that's the only war that's ever going to happen? I don't think so.
Right.
And then the buffer of climate. Good soils are an insurance policy against crop failure when we have weather stress.
That's it. That's a thesis right there. No, brilliantly put, and I love that it's sustainability in general. That's a great answer.
Yeah, sometimes it's not so bad to be old. I struggle a bit when I try to figure out what my grandkids are going to live through.
Yeah,
But
but you have perspective.
yeah, yeah.
Ah, well,
And,
thank
and
you, Rick.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, Jess. And if you have questions anytime, let me know. Happy to discuss.
Excellent. Thank you.